Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jedrowski. Chapter 6. The Wednesday after the party, I went to see the professor. I was more nervous than I thought I'd be, my mind circling in hostile loops as I walked the New World promenade. The air felt thin. I arrived at the office, knocked on the door. A subdued "come in" resounded from inside. I affected a confident smile. The professor gave me a wary nod. "Please sit down," he said, his voice strangely lifeless. His face seemed grayer than it had a couple of weeks earlier, as if he'd aged since the last time I saw him. The silence between us was heavy and seemed to sit entirely on my chest. "The board liked your proposal, Jedrowski," he finally said, in a strangely formal voice. I looked at him, uncertain. "They like it more than they want to admit, actually. Your writing is good. Your ideas worth exploring. You know that." I didn't know whether it was my turn to speak. I painted a smile, distorted his face. "But, as you might imagine, there are other forces at play too." My gut contracted. I looked at the professor, trying to read his face. I felt completely powerless. "There are other candidates," he went on, sounding tired. "Their proposals aren't as good as yours, but—" He took off his glasses, rubbed his eyes. "Some of them have contacts." Another silence, another glance from him to me, as if he wanted me to release him from this chore. My mind in free fall. "The final decision hasn't been taken yet, but if things continue as they now are, it doesn't look good for you. I need you to know this." He let out a sigh, looked at his desk, his papers, then back at me. "Then why have you called me in? What do you want me to do?" My voice was small and angry, more than I wanted it to be. The professor looked at me softly, as if he'd expected my anger. "I know how disappointing this must be for you." This made me feel more desperate. He placed both of his hands on the papers before him and leaned across the desk towards me, so I could see the simple gray hairs of his mustache and his kind, proud face, closer than I'd ever seen it. "I know you're not in the party," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And it's too late to join now anyway, even if you wanted to." He lowered his eyes, maybe embarrassed by what he was about to propose. "But maybe you know someone, Ludwig, someone you forgot to mention, and who could help tip the balance in your favor." His gaze on me was suddenly like yours the night of the party. Expectant, too much so. I sat still, entrenched in silence. Finally he nodded, visibly awkward. "Think about it. Maybe someone will come to mind. It would be a pity for you to miss this opportunity." It almost seemed that if I didn't acknowledge this moment, it wouldn't be true. I remained silent. The professor stood, attempted a smile. "Let me know as soon as you can, will you?" I managed to rise, to nod into space. We shook hands, like mine limp, his far too big. And a moment later, I was standing in the corridor with oblivious strangers hurrying past me in all directions. The academic year had started and new students were walking the grounds. New faces, so young-looking, I could hardly believe they'd finished high school. They strode around as if the place was theirs, as if no other student had ever been there before them. I left the campus, staggered through the streets, felt the wind bite my fingers and neck, gnawing at my head. It was a cold day, maybe the first really cold day of the season, and I was unprepared. I had neither scarf nor gloves nor hat. I had underestimated the weather. The trees were losing their leaves. I drifted about the streets, hardly knowing which way I was going. I just walked, put on one foot in front of the other, feeling the vague protection of the movement, its rhythm lulling me. But not enough to make me forget that my allowance would run out in a matter of weeks. Suddenly, I had no vision of the future, only a dreadful void. I'd been naive, stupid even. I saw it then, as long as I walked, though I didn't have to think. Didn't have to face anything for long. When I came to my senses, I was on Marzakovska Street. And there you stood, talking to a guy in a pair of sunglasses. The one Hania had danced with at the party. He introduced himself to Raphael and gave me his hand with a wry smile. It was unnerving not to see his eyes. We looked at each other, you and I, but we couldn't say anything. The sun was already weak and descending. It grew colder, but I didn't feel it anymore. From where we stood, on the city's straightest, longest street, you could see all the way to Constitution Square, with its gigantic, Stalinistic buildings, and carvings of muscled workers and strong, healthy mothers, and even further past the damaged church of the Holiest Saviour and towards the tiny square beyond where Hania and Maxio lived. It was only 4 o'clock, but night had already started to envelop us. We stood and waited under the neon sign of the restaurant, a large red mosaica in handwritten style, like a beacon of something better and more modern that might brighten our lives. We talked to Raphael, but my mind was absent. I can't remember a word we exchanged. I can't remember anything until a black Vespa stopped right in front of us. Hania was wearing a biker jacket and high boots, her hair untied, and Maxio had on a thick Alpine-style jumper, the color of cream. All their clothes looked new and foreign. I stared at them in awe as if they were a pair of actors from a Fellini film. We kissed on the cheek and shook hands. They seemed genuinely glad to see me, and already the tingling warmth of flattery began to soothe my nerves. We walked into Mosaica, where it was warm and soft. A low-ceilinged room, decked out in red carpet and uniformed black-tie staff, and again those giant potted palm trees, each leaf big enough to wrap a baby inside. Reaching into the room languidly and lazily and utterly aware of their own magnificence. The people there were the sort one never saw walking in the street, and so one would have been excused for thinking they didn't exist. Women with large wavy hair, heavy bright necklaces and fox collars, and men in well-cut suits and serious clean faces, smoke dancing up from their American cigarettes more slowly and more preciously than in the outside world. We sat in a booth by the tingled windows, on 2 padded leather benches facing each other, drinking vodka and smoking until we were surrounded in gentle fog. The waitress brought herring and sour cream and Ukrainian borscht with beef, and later a large red snapper for each of us. I felt like I was another person, in another city, leading a careless, elevated life. I was surprised by how easily I'd pushed everything else aside, including the meeting with the professor. The vodka helped. The waitress came round and filled our glasses, without anyone having to remind her. You next to me and Hania opposite, throwing a smiling looks. Maxio recounted one anecdote after another, mostly about girls he had tried to seduce, and you egged him on, teasing him until he told us more, as if you were just like him. I had never seen you like this, and was surprised to find that I liked it. In a way, I told myself, it wasn't really you. When I saw Hania staring at you, her eyes wide, mouth open in laughter, I couldn't feel jealousy. So, you're the reason we haven't seen our Januszek all these weeks, she said at one point, winking at me. I was beginning to worry some girl had stolen him from us, when really he was just in your sweet company. You groaned. Hania, do you have to flirt with all my friends? Maxio and Rafa laughed out loud. I blushed, despite myself. Hania rolled her eyes at you and looked at me with complicity. How come I never saw you on the field during the camp? I asked, trying to change the mood. Excellent question, Maxio cried. Sister dear, why did your Royal Highness not lift a finger? Not a single beetroot, all summer long. Now it was Hania's turn to blush. Stop teasing me, everyone, she said, affecting irritation, emptying her little glass of vodka and setting it back on the table with a bang that made the neighboring diners look up. I have delicate hands, she purred, and we laughed. Dessert arrived, ice cream with chocolate sauce, topped with an absurdly big mountain of whipped cream, served in a tall glass that resembled the trumpet of a flower. It was delicious. I felt like a child again, a happy one this time, whose wishes had always been granted. On the other side of the window, night had fallen, and dark figures moved past in the street with downcast faces and empty bags. And empty stomachs, I guess. But we didn't see them. It was so much better on the side of the glass, so much warmer, so much softer. We stayed late until there were almost no other guests. The bill arrived on a small silver platter, and everyone reached for their wallets, or pretended to, in my case. But Maxio waved us off. It's on us, he said, with a flick of his hand, walking over to the bar, where the waitress stood in front of the wall of foreign alcohols. She smiled at him with deference as he signed the bill and left her a tip. Outside in the cool air we stood and smoked Maxio's Marlboros, smoother than any cigarette I'd ever had. Hania looked around at us in her cat-like observing way and asked whether we wanted to go to their country house that weekend. We'll escape the city, make a little party out of it, she said, her eyes narrowing with satisfaction, her fine mouth curling into a smile. We all agreed and kissed each other good night, and watched them speed off on their Vespa towards the part of the town. Raphael waved down a taxi and was gone. Then It was just you and me on a large, empty avenue. We walked uptown. I reached out for your old self, waiting for our masks to wear off in the cold of the night. "I'm so happy you came," you said, looking at me in a loving, tipsy way, almost childish. "Wasn't it great?" "What did I tell you, huh?" I nodded. It was great. We walked on, the pavements deserted. It was late. I listened out for a sound of our steps. They were almost in unison, and something serious, something important that I'd pushed down all night long rose to the surface of my mind. I told you about my meeting with the professor, quietly, ashamed of my hopelessness, not daring to ask of you, only recounting. You listened attentively. We were on Poznanska Street, with its corded stones and tall pre-war kamienikas and lines of prostitutes, young ones and old ones, most in long coats and with mini skirts or tight dresses showing underneath, their bodies violently stretching the fabric, threatening to break it. They called out to us while I talked, accents coarse and loud, and we walked on without looking. "I'll give you a special price, sweetie," one of them cried with a clipped Silesian twang. "For such a beautiful face, and bring your friend too." The other woman chuckled, like hyenas in the dike. I didn't dare to look at you. I couldn't see anything funny in the moment. We reached the end of the street with the Palace of Culture towering before us, large, dark, and ominous, and beside it the train station, lit but seemingly empty. You stopped and looked at me with your consolatory smile. "Don't worry, this one is easy. You can ask Hania this weekend at her house." A flash of opportunity raced through me. After that night, the restaurant, anything seemed possible. "Are you sure?" You nodded. "She likes you, and I'm sure she can have some strings pulled for you. She and Maxio always had the exam questions in advance, you know. That's why I never needed to go to lectures. And at the camp, neither of them lifted a finger." I looked at my shoes, my head racing. "And it won't be weird with Hania coming on to you?" You smiled and shook your head lightly. "Did you see her tonight? She's not desperate. Besides, she falls for guys so easily. She's probably into you right now." You laughed again. "Okay then," I said, still anxious. "This weekend." We hugged, our cheeks coming up against each other, me feeling the beginning of your stubble. I always loved that sensation. "Good night," you said, turning towards the other side of the river. "Good night, my dear." I don't know why I didn't confide with Carolina. Part of me wanted to, longed for someone I could talk to completely. I suppose I wasn't ready. I was afraid she'd smile at me and say, "Here, here," or something cynical about the seductive taste of whiskey. I was afraid she'd warn me against asking for favors one couldn't return. The last thing I wanted right then was to be warned. So when I called her that week from a telephone box on the corner of my street, and she asked how I was doing, I put on the most cheerful voice I could manage and told her everything was all right. And I let her tell me how she'd fallen for that short boy she danced with at Hanya's party. His name was Carol. He was an engineer. I made a joke about their names, Carol and Carolina, how it was clearly meant to be, and she laughed, like in the old days. Then she asked me about the PhD. I said I hadn't seen my professor yet, that I was seeing him the week after, that I felt sure I'd get it. She said she'd cross her fingers for me, that she'd be happy for me. Hanging up, I missed her more than I had before the call. I walked back to the flat to prepare for the weekend away. I packed, unpacked, packed again, ironed my clothes. It didn't feel like I was going on holiday, but on a mission, from which I'd return changed. That evening, just to reassure myself, I walked back down into the cool street and to the telephone box. Luzio, I knew it. Would be you. Only you would call me so late at night. She sounded happy. Granny, how are you getting on, darling? I swallowed. Very well, Granny, very well. Are you sure? Do you need money? You know, I have almost nothing, but I set aside a little. I could send you that. No, Granny, I said, smiling into the receiver. I don't need money. It looks like I'm going to do a doctorate. I won't need your help anymore. Oh, Luzio. Her voice sounded teary. Are you proud of me, Granny? Of course I am, she sniffed. I leaned my forehead against the cold metal body of the telephone. And when will you come home, darling? You know, that's what I care about most, seeing you. Soon, I said, not sure whether or not it was true. Soon, when they confirm my doctorate. When I'm settled, I promise. I hung up, stayed there in the telephone box, in the little halo of the light bulb attached to the ceiling, protected by an iron grid, watching the night outside. My life was a tiny narrow corridor with no doors leading off it, a tunnel so narrow I bruised my elbows, with only one way to go. That or the void, I told myself. That or leave. The next day, we met on the square of the Three Crosses, on the steps of the domed church that stood in the middle of the pagan's temple. It was cold and overcast and overwhelmingly, despairingly gray. One of those particularly Varsovian days that makes you think the sun has ceased to exist and fear that your mind might suffocate underneath that impenetrable fortress of clouds. You were already there when I arrived, your bag lying by your feet. We kissed each other on the cheek. There was a strange air between us, as if we'd become accomplices in the game. Your eyes sparkled with mischief and play. Ready? You said, piercing me with them. I nodded, feeling a wave of nausea, pushing it away. Their car arrived on the square. I knew it was theirs before it had even stopped. Foreign cars were so rare, even I could tell them apart from the two other kinds that one could dream of owning in our country. It was neither a Malush, the tin can Fiat made for the socialist bloc, nor the Trabant, the larger, clumsier model from East Germany. Here was a thing as smooth and elegant as a Panther, a black Mercedes. It came to a halt by the steps of the church. The passenger window slid down, and Hanya, in a pair of gold-colored sunglasses, waved at us excitedly. "Come on, boys." We grabbed our bags and hurried down. We climbed in onto the brown leather bench in the back, where Maxio's blonde from the party was already sitting, like a very expensive doll. She wore a short leather miniskirt and a red bandana around her head. Hani introduced her as Agatha, and she nodded at us slowly, as if sedated. "Hey guys," said Maxio, turning around from the steering wheel with a smile in his eyes. "Let's do this." "Is anyone else coming?" I asked. Hanya spun around, her mirrored sunglasses still on, their lenses reflecting and distorting my face, which struck me as silly and pale. "Just us," she said, and smiled. We whizzed off, speeding seamlessly and effortlessly along the Ujadovsky Avenue. We passed the run-down palaces of the long-forgotten aristocracy, the Asienki Gardens with my hidden deer, and the gigantic gates and lines of soldiers that protected the castle that was the Soviet embassy. After that, the city turned sparse. We passed endless stretches of identical blocks, blockovisko upon blockovisko, with mud fields in between, where riotous hordes of children played. We passed factories smoking behemoth, big and solemn like sooty churches. The radio was on, playing something by Velvet Underground. Nico sang in a low, litanic voice, bells ringing and the guitar jittering, like a flickering mirage. Throngs of white birch trees came into view, naked in the late autumn, and all the more solemn. And fields, soaked brown fields, with women and men on horse-drawn plough. The sky was still covered, white-grey, like rice pudding. But in the countryside, among this nature, there was beauty in that, like the comforting duvet in the bed one takes refuge in. We chatted for some stretches, and were silent for others. The road on and on, rock music playing on the radio, Agatha humming along. Lights started to drain from the sky, and the earth began to undulate. Low hills surrounded us, and now it was all forest, a sea of pines. And then, at an unmarked dirt road, Maxio turned the car, and we drove all the way down through the dense forest until we came to a gate. Hanya got out and unlocked it, and we drove through, just as night was falling, along the avenue with tall safety poplars. At the end of the lane there was a house. It was white, clear against the dusk of a ghost, with thick, broad columns supporting the triangular roof of the veranda. Leaves and little twigs crunched under our shoes as we climbed out of the car. The house stood there majestically, oblivious to our presence. It was a dvor, an old country estate that must have been there for centuries already, and would outlive us all, I thought. And I admired it for that, for all it had already seen, and all it would see, and which we would never know. Maxio unlocked the front door, switched on the light outside. The smell of dirty cedar invaded my mind. They were old fiance stoves, fireplaces, and hunting trophies, the heads of boars and deer, oriental carpets covering the floors. A place of pleasure and peace, indifferent to governments, faithful to whoever happens to be in power. You said something about how impressive it was, this house, and I remained silent, thinking about undeserving you all were of it. We followed Hania upstairs. There she gave us our room. You and I would be sharing. She had the room next to ours. Maxio and Agatha had taken another bathroom upstairs. My parents are coming on Sunday, said Hania, pointing to a large door at the end of the corridor. That's their room. Isn't this house something? You said as we put down our things and unpacked. It's practically a castle. I nodded. I wanted to be alone, to have the place all for myself, to take everything in. There was a view over the garden, a park, really oblong and wide, like several sports fields, and bordering the forest. I stood and watched the last specks of light dissolve above it, forgetting myself until the darkness outside was complete and I could see my face in the window. I turned back to the room. It was large, probably as big as Pani Skaleska's little flat. There were 2 single beds, heavy and gleaming, separated by a nightstand with a porcelain lamp. A door led to a large bathroom with a bathtub. I turned on the tap, enjoyed the savage rumble of the water filling the tub. Steam rose from it. I undressed and got in, leaving the door open to see what I could of the park. The water was too hot, scalding almost, but it embraced me. I lay there for a long time, feeling my skin prickle from the heat, feeling droplets of sweat from my forehead, letting my mind wander. After a while, my eyes closed, all by themselves. When I woke, my body felt cold and suffocated by water. I got out of the bath, my head spinning with hunger, and dried myself with a towel as thick as a cutlet. Then I saw that you were gone. I dressed quickly and went downstairs, but found no one. I walked around, taking it all in. The defined wooden furniture, the smell of past fires, a large veranda leading out into the infinite darkness of the garden. The forest, a mere silhouette in the distance. And then there were voices, low and hushed. I couldn't tell whose they were. I walked to where I thought they were coming from. I found you and Hania in the kitchen. You were standing close together, as if dancing. I thought, but with your arms loose. Your face is concentrated and intimate. Hania spoke to you with a smile. You frowned, and then broke into laughter. Tell me, I heard her say teasingly, but you held her sphinx-like smile and shrugged. As soon as I approached, your heads turned to me in a single movement, and you edged slightly away from her. Her face changed from intimate to casual. "There you are," she cried. "Are you hungry, Lucio?" I looked at you for an explanation, but it was as if you were in character. "Starving," I said. That night, after dinner, roast beef and with beetroot mash and apples that Hania had brought from home and warmed up in the oven. We made a fire in the living room, played cards, and drank Bulgarian wine. But the scene I had witnessed between the two of you had pierced my role, made it harder to play. I was distracted, nervous. At the end of the evening, edged on by the rest of us, Agatha got up and sang. She sang with real sorrow, a song by Maria Radovich, that quiet and sad song about the old fairgrounds and the tin toys and the balloons. We were all still. Her voice commanded our minds in an unexpectedly sorrowful way. Not long after, Agatha and Maxio went to bed, and then it was only the three of us. Two couches opposite of each other with armchairs on three sides, a low table in the middle. He sat on the couch opposite her, me on one of the armchairs in between. We talked about what we would do the next day. I wanted to go to sleep, and yet I didn't want to leave you two alone. Then you announced you were going to bed and looked at me meaningfully, as if to say this was my chance. I didn't move. We did bid you good night, Honey and I. She smiled and looked out in the dark garden, or maybe in her reflection in the glass. Then she glanced at me. There was tension around her lips. "I'm so glad you've come," she said. She seemed nervous, and this surprised me. "Thank you for having me," I said. "It's wonderful here." "Of course," she nodded and looked towards the garden again, as if deciding something. "I hope I'm not being indecent, but—" She stopped, looked at her lap, and then at me again. "Allow me to ask you something personal." I said nothing, trying to stave off internal vertigo. "I don't mean to pry." She shifted, visibly uncomfortable, vulnerable even, but not nearly as much as me. "Tell me honestly, does Janusz have another girl?" A part of me wanted to laugh out loud, hysterically, until my throat, vocal cords, and stomach muscles hurt. The other part didn't. Was just plain exhausted. I kept my face neutral, shook my head truthfully. "No, you don't need to worry about that." "Really?" Her face changed, lightened. "It's just, he's so distant sometimes, and I don't understand why he's not really responding to me. You see what I mean?" Her eyes asked for reassurance. I looked at my fingers and nodded. "Does he ever mention me?" she probed. "Yes," I said ungenerously, wishing I could help her. "Yes, he does." She seemed hopeful, but unconvinced, her widened eyes revealing her need for more. "Does he like me? Has he said anything to you?" I swallowed. Vertigo, this time lucid, took hold of me. "I don't know," I said, aware it was the truth. "He hasn't told me. You have to ask him." The next morning, I awoke with a headache, bothered by the sunlight that came into the room. Your bed was made and you were gone. I took a shower and went downstairs, where all of you were sitting at the long table in the dining room. Hania and Agatha, both wet hair, combed back. and the air smelled of coffee. You were eating a roll with 2 slices of ham. "There he is," said Maxio when I entered, and everyone looked up and greeted me sleepily. "Hania was sitting beside you." After breakfast, we all went for a walk through the forest. It was damp. It had rained during the night and smelled of freshness and decomposition. We walked on layers and layers of fallen leaves and the last of the autumn's mushrooms. I tried to talk to Hania then, but we were never alone. And somehow I was glad about that. The day was too bright, and I knew I'd need alcohol to do it. That afternoon, Hania said she was preparing a surprise for us. After lunch, she and Agatha went out with 2 empty baskets. The 3 of us stayed behind in the house. You and Maxio played billiards downstairs, and I went up to our room. Upstairs, it was completely quiet. Before I reached our room, my eyes fell on a double door at the end of the corridor, and a dark curiosity overcame me. I listened out for a sound. There was nothing. I moved towards the door and pushed down the handle. It wasn't locked. My heart beating hard, I slipped in. It was a large room with a fantastic view over the park. There was a 4-poster bed, perfectly made. The air around it strangely solemn and untouchable, like the bed of someone recently deceased. I walked to the window, took in its view over the forest. Right by the window stood a shiny round table covered in framed photos. Hania and Maxio as children, chubby and small, but the same faces eating ice cream. Their parents, the father like an older, fatter version of Maxio, through with a different mouth, almost lipless, and the mother, tall and elegant, with Hania's dark eyes. And more recent one of the 4 of them standing and smiling with the Eiffel Tower behind them. And then my eyes fell on the photograph beside that one, and for a moment I saw without comprehending. My mind jarred. In it, their father was dressed in a military uniform, covered in honors medals. My own hands were shaking as I took the photo from the table and looked up close. I felt nauseous, dirty even. Hania's father and Gierek shaking hands, smiling at one another. The party secretary's face was broad, self-satisfied. Taking in Hania's father was apparent fondness. The same man who's looked down on me from countless banners and posters during the parades, the country's so-called savior, the one who'd ordered a price increases. I thought of an empty shops across the country, of Panikaleska, of the lives spent queuing for little or nothing. And then these smiles, fat and self-indulgent. I was dumbstruck. I wanted to throw the photo on the ground, to stomp on it, to feel the glass and the wood shattered beneath my heavy heel. To hear the paper rip, to see their smiles tear apart. It was only with great effort that I made myself put down the photo and walk back to our room. I lay on my bed, my eyes open. The whole scheme to ask Hania for help with my doctorate now seemed more obscene than ever. And yet I told myself that I had to do it. Just this one time. Ask for this one thing. And then never deal with them again. I closed my eyes and the world spun around me. my weight shifting and spinning with it. When I opened my eyes, the room was dark. I felt pleasantly dulled. Night had fallen outside. Laughter came from downstairs, and I heard footsteps in the corridor. You opened the door with an expression of barely suppressed excitement. "It's dinner time," you said, looking at me. "Are you coming?" I nodded. "I'll be down in a minute." I washed my face and put on a clean white shirt. When I came downstairs, something was already in full swing. A record was playing, and we're all in the kitchen. Wine glasses on the counter, you talking to Maxio and Agatha and Hania, hunched over, a pot on the stove. There was a strong earthy smell in the air. "What's for dinner?" I asked. Maxio looked up and smiled mischievously. "Hania's witch specialty," he said. "Not especially filling, but you won't feel any hunger. Trust me." Agatha chuckled. Hania threw him an indulgent look and turned to me with a long wooden spoon in her hand. She was wearing a purple wrap dress, and a huge amber pendant hung from her neck. "It's a special soup I make from time to time," she said, a smile playing on her lips. "I think you'll like it." "Either way, we need to make the most of tonight," said Maxio, looking irritated. "Tomorrow the rentals are coming." "Our parents are coming tomorrow," said Hania, without turning around. "But just for one night. They won't be bothering us." She took a large porcelain bowl and poured the soup in. It was the color of mud, dark and rich. "However, we won't be able to do this, so let's eat." We sat down at the table with a large bowl in the middle. Its earthy smell wafted up with the steam. Everyone looked expectant and excited, even Agatha. "What is this?" I asked. Hania looked around the group, everyone smiling at my question. "Zupa," she said meaningfully. "Poppy stem soup. It will send you flying." Her black eyes gleamed. You were sitting next to her and nodded at me encouragingly. She served me the first cup and handed it across the table. All eyes were on me. I held the cup to my lips and downed it in its entirety, pouring it into myself like medicine. I wanted to dissolve with it. There was a dark brown taste to it, bitter, unforgiving. They smiled at me and followed my head, all drinking too. We sat around looking at each other, Hania rubbing my hand across the table, giggling. You held her hand and Maxio's hand, and all took each other's hands and formed a chain. And moments later, or was it more than that, we were all sitting on our couches, spread out, joyous. My body was weightless. There was nothing on my mind, nothing at all. It was so light it floated. I saw you sitting near me, and all I felt was love. I closed my eyes and saw fields and flowers and the lake from the summer, and everything was there for me, only for me, and I loved myself, all of it, every atom, like I never had before. The music that was playing was the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard, every word of it. It was Serge Gainsbourg singing in French. I understood. It carried messages I had never expected were there. And we danced. You and me, Hania and you, me and her, Agatha and Maxio, all of us together. It was warm, so warm. The fire was burning. Heat enveloped us, and we started to undress, dreamlike, entranced, looking at each other like children without a trace of shame. One by one, clothes fell off to the ground. Jeans and skirts and shirts and blouses, socks and pants, until we were all naked. The air on our white bodies, the night around our pale skin. We were an army of erotic ghosts, and we were beautiful. Hania and Agatha, with their dark triangles between their thighs, and their breasts like overripe fruit. Agatha rounder and softer than Hania, whose skin was translucent, blindingly white, a Venus and a nymph. Maxio, his fleshy body like Samson, a colossus. His penis was massive, like a bull's, his chest hairy and broad like a drum. But you were the most beautiful of all of them. Your body was made of marble and absorbed the light of the moon. Agatha opened the veranda, and we ran outside, like children in midsummer night. We didn't feel the cold, only the embrace of the night air on our skin. It was like swimming, dripping into the air, our arms outstretched, reaching for the moon. "Let's play hide and seek," cried Hania, taking a cloth from the garden table, blindfolding Maxio. We turned him around and around, our fingers on his waist and hips, his penis swinging along with the turns, our hands slapping his backside. "Count to 30. We ran into the garden, into the forest, the girls in one direction, and you and I in the other. Grass and twigs tickled our feet. "You can take off your blindfold now," Hania's voice called from far away. You and I behind a tree, somewhere by the edge of the forest, our hands on the bark, beginning to freeze, and then finding warmth. Our arms around each other, our bodies formed one, protecting each other from the cold. Perfect in the night. We kissed. You were mine. And I realized then that this was the only thing that counted. Nothing else had ever existed. Just our lips and hips and thighs. I fell into different galaxies through you. Your mouth, a porthole to a better universe. And then the crackling of twigs behind us. And there was Maxio, standing naked a couple of meters away, looking at us with his mouth wide open, his eyes dilated, his body frozen. You could sense a quiver of fear run through your body. You tried to say something, but Maxio, completely out of nowhere, started to laugh. He laughed out loud like a crazy bear. It seemed like his laughter would bring the forest down, make the pines shed their needles. Your face lightened up suddenly, and you laughed too. "It was a joke," you cried, concentrating, looking at him. "Ludwig challenged me. I lost a bet." Maxio stopped laughing, his eyes flickering between you and me. The girls emerged from behind the trees. "What happened?" asked Agatha. "Why were you laughing?" Maxio turned around to them and started walking away. "Nothing," he said. "A hallucination. I won." We walked back to the veranda, and I couldn't look at you, only at the ground, not sure what had happened. I was hot. I was burning. I was entirely aflame. Then it was the next round, and my turn to be blindfolded. I laughed and laughed as they spun me, despite myself, and I counted. To 30, cold and dizzy, when I opened my eyes, and you were all gone. I walked into the forest, and there were Maxio and Agatha kissing in the clearing. I tapped them on the shoulder. They looked up and smiled, and continued their embrace. "I'll find the other two," I cried, running further into the forest. Over fallen trunks and little valleys. I ran until I was lost, until I was sure I'd lost you. I tried to find my way back. The forest had started to close in on me, to turn from enchanting to threatening. It felt like a nightmare, and I knew my mind wasn't working clearly. I stopped, tried to calm myself. Then an owl hooted somewhere behind me, and I turned. Witnesses glowed behind a tree, like a luminescent stone in the sea. I walked towards it, fast, my heart beating with imminent success. And then I saw the different shades of white, darker white and lighter white, matted marble and chalk. 2 bodies on the forest floor, legs entwined. I stood watching your feet move over one another, soles black with earth and leaves, writhing, struggling. There was cruelty in those round forms on top of another. You over her, your chest over hers, her closed eyes lit by moonlight. I turned back and ran. I ran and started to shiver all over, like a child who's broken through ice and fallen into the lake, and only just managed to crawl out. I ran and ran, becoming completely and utterly numb, not feeling a thing, not feeling the cold, not feeling my lungs, only terror propelling me forward. It felt like if only I ran fast enough, and this would not be true. Then, the further I ran, the further I would be from what I'd seen. When I got to the house, Maxie and Agatha were there, looking at me as if I were a ghost, asking me questions I couldn't hear. I only saw their mouths moving. I thought I would suffocate or faint. It was as if I hadn't breathed at all during my run, as if I hadn't breathed in years. There I stood and felt my head deflating, my whole being draining of air. And I began to pant like a horse after a race. I bent over, hands on my knees, trying not to drown in the emptiness, the vacuum of myself. But something inside was broken, no doubt about it. "Are you okay?" asked Maxio. I saw then that they were dressed again. I had never felt so naked in my life, so utterly vulnerable. I shook my head. Then the lights went out. I remember I vomited during the night, convulsively. It felt like I was setting something free, ridding myself of a monster. I remember nothing else, apart from the feeling that I wasn't in control of my body. The thought went through my mind that I might die, that I didn't have the strength or the wits to do anything about it, that I just had to let it happen, whenever it was going to be. And then, like something heavy and wet sliding into the black hole in the ground, I fell asleep again. When I woke, I didn't know who I was. My mind was a clean slate, just for one beautiful moment, until the memory came crashing down. I was lying in the bed in our room upstairs, naked under the covers. My guts and head were burning. The curtains were drawn, faint sunlight glowed underneath and around their edges. You in the other bed, asleep. Your shoulder moved almost imperceptibly. Your breathing inaudible. I pulled myself up. My body was heavy and unfamiliar. Every moment felt unusual. I put on some clothes, threw the rest of my things into my bag. You didn't stir as I walked out. I moved across the silent corridor, went oriental carpets downstairs to the room with a fireplace. It was cool. Empty bottles on tables, the faded smell of cigarettes. And in the middle of the room, like some bizarre offering, was a mound made up of cloth. Outside, on the veranda, there was a burnt spot where the fire had been. Birds, small and fat, with orange beaks, flew around excitedly, picking at something in the dewy grass. A pair of panties, wide and lacy, discarded like someone's fantasy. I walked out through the front door, left it open. Behind me, across the gravel path, through the open gate at the end of the poplared avenue. The trees and the dirt road already made me feel like I was breathing more lightly. The sun was still coming up, sending butter-colored light across the park. And I was so glad to be on this path by myself, so endlessly glad. But just when I was about to reach the road, a black limousine with tinted windows came towards me. I kept my head down, accelerated my steps, hoping it wouldn't stop, hoping Hania's parents, is that who was in there, wouldn't interrogate me. The car passed without stopping or slowing down, gravel crunching beneath its massive wheels. I reached the main road, breathing in and out. I reveled in the emptiness. Then a crunch bell rang in the distance, and I decided to find it. I walked along the forest road, horse-drawn carts with families passed by, and the ringing of the bell became more distinct. Not long after, a village appeared, along with a church. It was wooden and old, its spire almost black. People streamed in, families, old people, children in hordes. I followed them into the darkness inside. The organ was playing, and a soothing cloud of heavy incense hung in the air. I stood among boys and young men in suits, some with unruly hair, many with heavy, broad faces, burnt and weathered, blue eyes, caps in their hands held in front of their crotches. Whenever a woman came in, another boy would get up from the benches, shooed by his mother, and stand with us men, letting the women pass. No one seemed to notice me. I was invisible in the crowd. The priest stepped up to the pulpit in white and purple robes, greeting the congregation. Then the organ started up again, and everyone began to sing. The notes moved slowly through the space and through the crowd, elevated, unified us, passed through the single body of us, and up to the murky windows and the dark ceiling. Tears gathered in my eyes, releasing themselves. I joined in the singing.